the longest running psychological study of its kind, tracked people at Harvard University over like almost 100 years now across multiple generations, and they found that one thing mattered for how happy you are and how long you live. That one thing, your relationships. The quality of your relationships determines the quality of your life, period. And so in this video, I'm gonna try to introduce what I view are the 4 kind of key habits for happy relationships. And of course, a couple things, right? So there's way more than 4. There's literally, this video could be 10 hours. It could be an entire course. It could be an entire book. I'm doing my best to distill all of this research and books on happiness and psychology and well-being back here into what I think are very 4 kind of very simple, tangible best practices to help you get the most out of your relationships. So let's get into it. And that idea I shared at the beginning is kind of a key foundation here, because you can imagine all this work I do on happiness and coaching and training, consulting, videos, teaching. It's always like, well, what's like the secret to happiness, or what's like the one thing, right? And the truth is there's not really any one thing. But if I were to like pick in terms of your priorities, it honestly would probably be relationships. And I say that because of that study I just referenced. And there's a TED Talk on it that's pretty popular now from Dr. Robert Waldinger. And he talks about really in depth this study. And it's like, you can look at all the different variables, how much money people make, how successful they are, where they live, what they do, and even things around like their physical health. And it's just quite simple that the most comprehensive psychological study of its kind found that there's a clear consensus answer. Like, it's your relationships. Those are what matter most. And so important to understand before we even get into the habits or the how to or whatever. It's like, if you want to be happier, start with your relationships and investing in your relationship quality. Okay. So I'm going to give you just 4 practices here to consider to help you get started. All right. The first is to become genuinely interested in other people. And I remember this, I was at a wedding. Okay. And so I'm talking to this guy, he works in a steel mill, and it was very mundane work. Like, hey, this thing comes down the assembly line, I screw on this piece and send it down. Like, okay, let's, try to be interested here. And it's like, yeah, things come down, I screw it on and go. I'm like, oh, well, what else? And it's like, you're not going to believe this. Sometimes the thing like comes down the line and it's a little bit crooked. And so I have to like turn it a little, and then guess what? And then I screw on the piece and send it down. So I just tried to like ask questions like, well, what's that like? What do you do? Why do you do it? Like, what else? How does this fit into your life and other areas? And like at the end of the day, or at the end of the night, like I literally said like nothing. He just the whole time talked about the steel mill and manufacturing and all these technical details. I had no idea what he was talking about. And at the end of the night, he came over and he's like, oh my gosh, Jackson, you are so interesting and such a great conversationalist. And that was such a great talk we had. And like, meanwhile, I'm like, I still literally know nothing about engineering or steel stuff. But like, what happened there? To be interesting, be interested. You want to become genuinely interested in others and like talk in terms of their interest, right? And like what makes them feel important. The more important you can make them feel, the more successful you're going to be. I heard this story that was from, I think, like Margaret Thatcher or something. And she talked about 2 different prime ministers of England. And she was like, yeah, the first guy, I forget his name, but he was not quite as successful. The other guy was Ben Disraeli. And she was like, yeah, I sat next to him the first night and felt like this guy was the most interesting man in all of England. But the second night, when I sat next to Ben Disraeli, I felt like the most interesting woman in all of England. And as you may imagine, Ben Disraeli was far more successful in his political career. Why? Again, because he made the other person feel important. He talked in terms of their interest. And it's like literally that simple if you want to be better at connecting with people and investing in these relationships, even like having people be around you. And maybe the best way to understand this, I love this, is from Peter Kaufman, okay? Credit to him in his talk on multidisciplinary thinking. But he even asked, like, what are the only animals that don't have to work for a living? Like even you maybe say cats, right? But they usually would have to like go, you wouldn't want them to like hunt mice or do something like that, right? Historically. He's like, no, it's a dog. And he has this joke where he talks about your dog goes into the backyard and talks to your neighbor's dog. And he says, hey, can you believe how easy it is to like manipulate human beings and get them to do whatever you want them to do for you? And the other dog's like, yeah, it's a piece of cake. All you have to do is every single time they come home, greet them with the biggest show of interest and enthusiasm and making them feel important, making them feel like they're the center of the universe, the most important thing in the entire universe. And all you have to do is do that for like 30 seconds, and then you can go back to whatever you were doing before and ignore them for the rest of the night. And right, it's like true. And what does the dog get back in exchange for that? Everything, literally everything. And so I'm not trying to, like, it's kind of a joke. We're not trying to be manipulative here, but like practically speaking, it's true. If you want everything from everyone, the way to do that is to show them you care, to go first, to be genuinely interested in them, to make them feel important, to frame things in terms of their interests, and right, have that orientation towards the conversation instead of having to worry about like, well, how do I be interesting, or how do I get something out of this, right? Okay, so that's number one. Become genuinely interested in other people. And there's a great book on this, by the way, that rule comes from, How to Win Friends and Influence People, which again sounds like salesy or manipulative, and it can be used that way. We don't want to use it that way, but it's really just practically speaking, like practical psychology of how to deal with people, because we don't get that in school, even though it's like life's most important thing. Okay, so that's a book you can read, but this is the first rule. Okay, second rule, bring the weather. Okay, and I sometimes say it as leaders bring the weather, but in your relationships, you bring the weather. Now, what do we mean by that? So there's something called mirror neurons. Okay, and this has to do in psychology, it's sometimes called reciprocity. But all primates actually have something called mirror neurons, which means when I show a certain expression, like anger, like I'm going to come at you, or I'm really happy and nice to see you, or I stick out my hand. What do? You stick out your hand back. There are literally neurons in our brains, because we're such highly social primates, that fire and express the expressions that we pick up on others, even whether it's gestures or facial expressions, etc. Literally in some kind of subconscious level in your brain, my expression right now is like registering and firing, and you're mirroring it back. Right? And you can imagine if my video was like kind of down here and dark and depressed, you'd feel that energy, and where I'm like up here and a little more excited, you feel that too, right? And have you ever had that happen where you're just like kind of in, let's say, a good mood, and someone comes into the conversation and it's just like so down, like, oh, this happened, and I'm fighting with my wife, and you can just feel the whole thing sink. But at the same time, you know certain people that somehow like they're always just ready to go, and you probably feel a little bit more energy around them. And so we're not saying you have to be fake here. It's just trying to like be mindful and intentional of the emotional context and the emotional energy you're bringing to that every interaction, and knowing that by consciously changing how you show up, you can change the state of that relationship and that interaction. You know, I've heard it said before that reality is an energy mirror. Here you get back what you put out. And it's not true 100% of the time, but it's largely true in all your interactions. I mean, even think about it. You know, you walk into a hotel and it's like, hey, this is Jackson checking in. How's the person going to react? Right? Probably like, okay, hey, thanks. What's your name? We say, hey, good to see you. What's up? This is Jackson checking in. How are they going to react? They'll probably smile back, right? It's like I said, you walk up to someone at a party and you kind of just keep your hands in your pockets. You're down here, hey. What are they going to say back? Hey. Or you smile and you go right at them and stick out your hand. What are they going to do? They're not going to look at you crazy. They're going to stick out their hand, okay? And so, like, it's so maybe obvious or subtle sounding, but I can't state that enough. Leaders bring the weather. You bring the weather in terms of the emotional context and emotional dynamic of the interaction. So why not aim to make it a little bit more positive and a little bit more intimate? That's right, because that reciprocity principle also exists for building and deepening a connection. You know, if you have a certain friend that all you talk about is like, oh, hell, you know, the weather lately, man, yeah, it's been pretty cold. Oh, how about that football game? Like, that's fine, but it's not really going to progress any deeper. But if you don't have to be crazy, but you role model a little bit of vulnerability, right? You bring the weather, you go first. You say, well, hey, how are you doing in terms of, I don't know, your relationship right now? Or you might even open up, hey, you know, I've been struggling a little bit with XYZ. Could I get your thoughts on that? And then what happens? They're going to open up a little bit. They're going to open up, and you go back and forth like that. And there's actually a study and experiment you can look up called the 36 Questions for Increasing Closeness. And we'll explore more of that. But it basically does that. Researchers designed these set of questions that made people become fast friends. And some of the people that did the study actually later got married. But it was 36 questions. And if you like follow them, it's basically just this idea, right? This idea of you bring the weather, right? That you can go first and create that reciprocal sharing of increased like connection and vulnerability and trust. Like the question will be like, a little bit personal and then a little more and then a little more, and each person shares and they go back and forth. And pretty soon by the end, you're like best friends with this person, sharing stuff that you can't even believe you're sharing. Why? Because you have that reciprocity, okay? So we want to understand that you need to bring the weather to that interaction, one of positive emotion, generally speaking, and being willing to go first and create that reciprocal vulnerability that's going to deepen the relationship. Finally, this is a short rule, but it's good to keep in mind. The only way to win an argument is to avoid it. And if you're going to, in your mind right now, the only way to win an argument is to avoid it, you may have a tendency to say, oh, I want to argue that. Okay, well, there you go. Cut that off, right? And it's not to say you don't assert yourself or stick up for yourself or respectfully disagree with someone. It's just simply saying, like, honestly think about it. Have you ever won an argument? Have you ever just had it escalate and you get a little more upset and they get more upset and you have to prove yourself right and they're wrong and you go back and forth, I'm right, you're wrong, blah, blah, and it gets real personal, and then all of a sudden the other person says, you know what, I'm so glad you started this argument and totally educated me and opened up my mind. Like, I am so wrong and you're so right. Wow, that's really wonderful. We can be best friends now and I'm going to believe exactly what you believe because you just won that argument. No, okay? Like the moment it becomes an argument, that's what we're talking about here, that frame, you basically can't win. Because you're either going to get in a fight or it's going to get ugly, or they're going to even maybe feel like you won, but then they feel discouraged and not really into the relationship. And so I have been faced with this choice many times in my life and chosen wrong. But the advice, the wisdom is, would you rather be right or be happy? Okay, so again, not to say you can't have appropriate conflict or stick up for yourself or push back or assert yourself. It's simply just saying that, like, when you start to get into this feeling of like anger or an emotional tie to being right or wrong, and it's that argumentative orientation, there's no way to win an argument. Right? I remember in that Dale Carnegie book, this little saying here, it's something like, here lies the body of John O'Day, who died defending his right of way. He was right, dead right as he rode along, but he's just as dead as if he were wrong. Follow that? Right? Like this guy's trying to merge onto the highway and he has the right of way. He knows it. He's in the right. He's got to stick to it because he's right. The other person's wrong. And at the end of the day, if you get in a car crash, who gives a shit? So the only way to win an argument is to avoid it. That's number 3. Number 4, this is a broad principle that I'll try to run through real fast here. I want you to run your life like a business. And that may seem counterintuitive, especially coming from like a happiness guy, but here's what I mean. Like when it comes to your relationships, like in marketing and business, you have a CRM, that's a customer relationship manager, which is like an entire software system built out to add value, to keep in touch, and to like manage all your relationships. And it's like, what's more important than the business relationships? Like the relationships of your life. So when I talk about run your life like a business in terms of your relationships, I don't mean being like shallow or you have to get stuff out of people. I mean, you should have that same degree of intention and organization that you do if you were running a business. Okay, and here's what a couple of examples of what I mean by that is setting aside time as if you were scheduling meetings for the most important people in your life, right? If you're the CEO of the company and you have your VP of sales, your VP of operations, your VP of finance, you're going to be meeting with them regularly, okay? Well, you have your boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, partner, whatever. You have your kids, you have your best friends, you have your siblings, you have your parents, you have whoever. Like, you need to be intentionally setting aside time to develop those relationships, right? Being as intentional at that time as you are, your daily planner and your daily tasks and whatever. More advanced like way you can even do this is creating, again, that CRM idea, but like systems to keep in touch. Like I'll pull out my phone and even show you just a couple of real brief examples, okay? 2 of the most like important things to me that I've ever done in my entire life. Like this is just a simple spreadsheet, okay? And what you'll see right there is like people's names, and then there's a status, which is like the category of person they are, which like, again, I'm not trying, like, it doesn't sound shallow, but it's just like my really close friends, my mentors, my extended friends, extended family. And that way I can just kind of sort, but I literally just have a sheet here where I can kind of keep track on who I'm in touch with and not, and look and see like, oh, I haven't talked to my godfather Marty in a little bit. Like maybe I should do that. Or I'm driving for a few hours. Who do I feel like catching up with? Oh, I'm going to give Mason a call. Like just having that organized system. And again, this took me an hour to do. I just had one of my assistants do it. Is you can just even have them take that checklist and put into your phone little reminders. So if I just go to a random day here, so this is January 23rd. If you look right at the top there, there's like these little reminders. And one of them says, keep in touch, Bernal. The other, which my other godfather, and the other says, keep in touch, John Caranta. That's another friend of the family. Oh, and that's my mom's birthday. Okay, so I need to get her a gift. All right, that's another example because that's in my calendar because it's important. Okay, so the protocol here is not to say you have to do it exactly my system, but it's like, building formal reminders and formal mechanisms to ensure that you are investing adequate time and attention in those relationships. And that's especially important for keeping in touch with your old friends. I've heard it said that one old friend is worth two new ones. And so much of the time, I think we become lonely because we're not investing in those friends, those old friends, right? We lose touch because we're all busy and doing our thing. And we might not have formal checkpoints for our most important relationships. Like literally, you could have I've heard this done, like a weekly brief with your significant other or with your kids where you're like, hey, we're going to set aside this time to just check in. How are we doing? What's going well? What's not going well? Let's see how we're doing, check in, and spend some time with each other. Okay, so when I say finally to step back here, running your life and your relationships like a business, obviously, again, I don't mean like shallow, trying to pull value out of them, but thinking in terms of intentionality, systems, right? Your own little CRM or your keep in touch system so that you're really systematically investing in developing these relationships, which are the currency for happiness, okay? And just like a business, you want to give them value, right? Which means that you show up for them, you care for them, and you think about their interests, not just yours. So I gave you a lot here. Again, I didn't really get into the references as much in this video and like the scientific literature, studies. Obviously, it's all grounded in research, but I wanted to be short and practical, and I kind of succeeded, maybe a little long. So here are your rules again. If you want to be interesting, be interested, right? Make others feel important and talk in terms of their interests. Be genuinely interested in them. Number 2, bring the weather. Remember that reciprocity, okay? So you shift the emotional context and dynamic and that building of intimacy and vulnerability and trust. Number 3, the only way to win an argument is to avoid it. By the way, credit to Dale Carnegie for that one as well. And number 4, run your life and your relationships like a business. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.